Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for sticking out the tough weather to get here and surviving the day. This is our second to last panel segment here in Shane Battier room at the 2023 Sloan Sports and Analytics Conference. I'm Max Williams, first year MBA student here at MIT Sloan, and I am super pumped to be welcoming you to this hockey panel. We have hard cap constraints, roster construction in the hard cap era of the NHL. We have an incredible panel and an incredible moderator. We have Kate Madigan with us, who's the assistant GM of the New Jersey Devils. We have Brett Peterson, assistant GM of the Florida Panthers. We have Megan Chaika, who's the co-founder and CEO of Stathletes. And then we have Dominic Moore, who will be our moderator, former NHL player, current NHL analyst on ESPN. So timing of the trade deadline, winding down the season to the Stanley Cup run, I don't think we could have timed this one any better. So it should be a good one. If you have questions for our panelists, our moderator, please submit them via Twitter at that hashtag HockeyHardCap. I'll be moderating over there, and we'll do about 45 minutes up here. Last 10, 15 minutes or so will be for audience Q&A. And with that, Dominic, it's all you.
All right. Thank you, Max. Welcome, everybody. Really excited for what should be a really fascinating talk here. I'd like to thank our panelists. A busy, busy week. So it really means a lot for everyone to join us here. About 20 minutes ago, just down the road, the Bruins and the Rangers faced off. I thought, they would be potentially a good entry point for our discussion about roster construction. These are two teams right now that are, at the top, near the top of everyone's list for cup contention. They're also two teams that had very different stories in terms of how they've been built. Bruins have been contenders for the better part of 13 years since they won the Cup in 2011, 2 finals. The Rangers reached the final 2014, President's Trophy the year after that, conference finals, but then went into a deep rebuild. So this question of roster construction, the philosophies, the dynamics that underlie them, I thought that might be a good opening discussion for each of you to share kind of what your thoughts are. And Megan, I guess we'll start with you.
Sure, maybe this is too simplistic, but essentially you do have picks, prospects, rosters, and then cap that you can weaponize to, create this environment for your team that's optimal, not only for, now, but obviously winning the Stanley Cup. That's what you want to achieve. And so there's no one way clearly to do it, but there's clearly better paths forward. And I think looking at it too, you realize that some do have to be drafted and developed and can be very expensive later on. So look at someone like Tage Thompson that people kind of gave up on. There's certain types of players, even defensively, that you have to look. I see some Buffalo fans in the crowd. I had to give Tage a shout out. But there's certain, players that you can't just say, hey, let's pick them up for, $12 million down the road. In a hard cap era, you don't have that ability to do too many of that. So you see some of the teams that are stuck with some of these big contracts, either they can't move them or they also don't have space to then acquire these other pieces that they need to make that run. So there's a fine balance where you have to think hard cap is great and has advantages, of course, in business, but for the game and for salaries, is it the best way for hockey forward too?
Mm-hmm. Brett, do you have anything to build off that?
Yeah, I think in today's NHL, especially, you have to establish a way to retain talent too. And you have, your elite players, and I think both clubs that you have mentioned have done an excellent job of creating a sense of identity and culture within their organizations, and they've been able to get their core and top players to buy in. And I think that has really helped them, because then they have a good building block, and then they begin to build around that. And special players can do special things.
For sure. Kate, we have talked before about the two different philosophies, but what are some of the underlying factors that maybe lead a team to say, now's the time we really need to, there's two teams right now that you'd say they've been hanging on, if it's Pittsburgh or Washington, that they've got aging superstars. What are some of these, underlying factors that drive decisions, whether to rebuild or hang on there?
Yeah, I think with Boston and the Rangers, they're both working, right? So there are different ways to do it. I think you have to be honest with yourself when you're looking. It depends on when you're at that point of contention, what your cupboards look like, what players you have. For me, the biggest thing is when you create your plan to be disciplined to it, it's very easy to have external pressure to change, to go after a certain player, give up certain picks. If you're disciplined, which I think both of these teams have, that's what really helps them get to where they want to be. We were in a similar position with the New Jersey Devils a couple of years ago. A rebuild, I like to say retool, it sounds nicer, a little softer. But for us, you need to be honest and you need to make hard decisions. And I think both of these teams and their general managers and their groups did that, and that's where they're at now.
You know, I want to talk about the Devils. You guys came on a lot stronger this year than people expected. I think we could see it developing. You see that, you know, the discipline, you guys sticking to the plan, but I think surprised a lot of people this year and maybe even yourselves. What have you learned? You know, I know you made some key moves in the offseason that probably changed the projection, but were there other things that maybe surprised you, other things you might have learned in the process that amplified where you were last year to this year?
Yeah, I think pressure is a privilege, so there's higher expectations for the Devils now, which is great. I didn't expect to go and win 13 games in a row. That was certainly fun. So we'll take those wins when you get them. But there's lots of highs and lows throughout the season, you guys know. For us, I think we had some acquisitions in the off seasons, and it needs to fit what your team is doing. So sometimes it does happen to be the best player, but it also needs to be the best player for you. I think a lot of times there's weight, as there should be, on points, goals, things like that. What we found is there's also weight in the intangibles. So the culture for us was huge. Leadership, veterans, players with experience. 2 years ago, we were the youngest team in the league. So if we want to go into a postseason push, playoffs is a totally different level of hockey. So having guys who have done that and be ready for it. So I think some of those intangibles has what's progressed us to what maybe the expectations were at the beginning of the year. But we also, as you continue to exceed, your expectations rise. So what we expect from our staff and our players is a lot higher than it was at the beginning of the year because some of those intangibles.
You know, speaking of expectations rising, Brett, you guys win the President's Trophy last year, and you bow out to the Lightning in the playoffs. And with the expectations where they are, you guys go out and make some pretty gutsy decisions. Changing some of your best players, bringing in some new faces, changing the coach. What can you share about some of the thought that went into that? You know, right now you guys are in the hunt, but not a sure thing that you'll be a playoff team this year.
Well, I think, you know, when you go through a season, you always, teams have to reevaluate where you're at and where you're going and what your plan is and both your short-term and your long-term goals. And, you know, sometimes you have to give something to get something. I think in all situations around the league, from a managerial standpoint, you're always looking at what your tandem is and how is your team fit within your plan and how quickly can you get there. And we felt that we had a situation where it's a special player. And you know, I think with our vision and putting that across with learning the last couple years, playing an unbelievable team like the Tampa Bay Lightning, who has gone through it for 8-9 years, you know, that's the standard. And you know, hard decisions have to be made all the time, and that was certainly not an easy one, but we're happy that we made it.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind actually for me is if you look at the New York Rangers, the 92 Rangers, they won the President's Trophy but bowed out early in the playoffs. They made significant changes. The next year, they actually didn't make the playoffs, but what happened the year after that? They won the President's Trophy and won the Cup. So hopefully, there's good things in store for you guys as well.
We'll take it.
Megan, trade deadline.
Yes.
Yesterday.
I was not here.
I don't think I can recall a more aggressive, exciting trade deadline as there was, the weeks leading up to this year. I mean, it was bonkers.
I think it was like over 40 trades made, which hasn't, happened for a long time, right? And it's been hard. Part of the problem with that hard cap is it's like, sometimes you even need that third team then to take on some of the salary, retain that salary to make that move. So there's some difficult calls, but teams obviously started early this year. I mean, there's a lot of inventory, people at the top that needed to get better. That Metro division is nasty now. I mean, you have the Rangers, the Devils, Carolina. You know, they even made some moves, and you're like, did you need to? You know, Boston made some moves. Did they need to? They just got better.
Were there any trends that you saw particular with this year's trade deadline strategy-wise, either with the contending teams, which you started to mention, or even some of the non-playoff teams, what they were trying to do?
Yeah, there's obviously people preparing for the future, but I'd say those like first and second rounders aren't going for like the price that they were previously, and there's a lot of pressure on some of these teams, whether it's a Boston feeling like, hey, we're still in our window, like let's go for it, or like the Leafs to shake up, hey, we're probably going to see Tampa, and we have to do something that's different, right, to get past that, you know, core that's just so strong, Stamkos, Vasilevsky. Now you have Shesterkin and the Rangers, and them bringing in a couple, you know, very elite scorer in Tarasenko, and then an elite playmaker in Kane. I know we laughed before about there's only one puck, but anytime you're getting better, I think, in terms of making some of those moves to win in the playoffs, it's interesting, because clearly the President's Trophy winner, you know, rarely wins the Stanley Cup. It's a different style of hockey. You're playing this series where you're actually matching up, and, you know, you win and compete differently. So a lot of motivated teams this year, but it made for great TV too.
It did. A lot of motivated teams, almost seemed like they all felt the apocalypse was coming and they better win the cup now. Kate, you guys were one of the teams that made a big move, acquiring Timo Meier. Is there anything you can share about what made him a great fit, how you guys decided to make an investment like that in a player like him?
Yeah, won't give away too much. But for us, I think there's a difference too when you're a buyer or seller. How things come about is you generally know through November, December where teams are at, and names start coming about. So Timo Meier was someone that we had on our target. I think everyone did for a while. He's anytime you can have the 3 S's, speed, skating, skill in one player, it's awesome. So for us to acquire him was a no-brainer. When we think through decisions, there's 1,000 things that come into play. Injuries, pro scouting, does he fit the salary cap, culture, analytics, all these things. And this is one of the players where they all matched up, which doesn't happen often. So it's like, okay, this is a pretty easy sell. Now let's see what it's going to cost us, acquisition price. So for us, it was someone that we had, we knew that we've wanted a scoring winger as well. We had other acquisitions in the offseason in our defense. So this was something that we knew for the past 6-9 months we were going to try and acquire. His name obviously fit the category, and we went from there. And then it's a grueling process going through trades. Brett knows as well is we'll give you this, we'll give you this. I don't want to give that. Well, what about this and this? I don't like that either. And you go back and forth for a while. Sometimes it's days, sometimes it's weeks. I don't think I've ever been in a month-long one, but it is a process. So for us, it was late Sunday night, like 10:30, you're in the office and you're grinded down and you make the trade and you're like, whew, okay. Like you can sleep a little lighter that night. So for us to get him was pretty spectacular, and he'll play for us here soon, and we're excited to see what he'll do. And then there's the question of who does he play with, right? You got to find that out, figure that out. We have had a strong season, so you don't want to shake things up too much line-wise, but I'm excited to see him. And he's got a little jam, so we needed that as well. Can't have enough jam.
Can never have enough. You know, one of the trends I think I noticed was just some of these moves that didn't just have a short time horizon. You know, Meier's probably a good example. Another one that comes to mind for me is Tanner Jeannot going to Tampa. I mean, this is a guy that's 25 years old. So this is a move that will help them now, but also help them in the future. But also, you know, they had to invest more for that. You know, time will tell to see how these things play out, as you mentioned. Brett, along those lines, one of the, I think, tougher decisions that organizations need to make these days is that call about investing in the young stars early, you know, in hopes to keep their cap number down for a long term. But, you know, you're also making that decision a lot earlier than in past eras where you have a more limited body of work. Is there anything that you can share about the process of how you evaluate, project, and ultimately decide what you're willing to invest in those kinds of players, those kinds of decisions?
Yeah, well, you know, I sat on both sides of this table. I was an agent for 15 years, and as an agent, you want to get them right out of that entry-level system as quickly as you can because that's where you get paid, right? So whatever you got to do, get in here, get out, let's get paid. And it's actually pretty interesting because as an agent, you're like, you guys got all the money in the world, you know what I mean? And now flipping the side and you go to the managerial side, you have your recipe and you have to assess what, an asset is worth, player's worth, where your team is at that particular moment. And, again, what's your long-term goal? And, we have, it's a process that goes through, and I speak for most teams, scouting and analytics and assessing what something's worth and what you're willing to pay for it. And if you can get into that sweet spot and find a good fit for your club and in your cap, and everybody nowadays in the hard cap era, you have to be always mindful of what the implications could be. So, I think everyone's looking for a deal, and if you can find the right players and it fits your club and your vision, then you go ahead and make it. Mm-hmm.
Megan, Stathletes, your company, it tracks data all over the world, all leagues, all levels, men's hockey, women's hockey. What are some of the areas that you've seen in terms of areas of attention that are growing, or things that your customers are coming to you and saying, you know what, we're paying more attention to this, please give us this? Like, what are some trends you've seen in that regard?
That's a good one. I think one is like leveraging the AHL team and system and understanding so much more about player development, also using that in their cap too, right? If they have a close AHL team that they can move players up and down more seamlessly, right? They're not jumping on a flight and mad that they're going halfway across the country. It just gives them more flexibility, but it also allows them to have that longer window where they can invest in their players, they're bought in, they possibly want to sign more long-term, and then getting those deals structured that make more sense. So you see the big market teams now, big bonuses, front-ended so that they can possibly trade the contract if they need to, and it's more valuable in that way to get more return for it because, you're not paying a huge salary for a player that's really mark-to-market under that salary and performance.
Mm-hmm. For sure. We've been talking about cap management, finding value, some of the player evaluation metrics, things like that. We'll go back to Kate, I guess, to start with this, but I want each of you to weigh in on this. What are some of the things that maybe not as easily measured that you're trying to build in? We're all data-driven decision making now. Your organizations are built that way. How do you find that balance in terms of incorporating these intangibles, but also continuing to be disciplined to a data-driven framework?
Yeah, a little bit of what I talked about before, what we evaluated over the summer, some of those intangibles, the leadership, hard to play against is one, right? You can measure it in some ways, excuse me. The culture they bring, all those intangibles, the metrics, for us, it's all a piece of the puzzle. So if you already have an extremely vocal group, you can never have enough leadership, but maybe that's not something that you're focusing on as much. If you already have a penalty killer, it's all kind of things like that. So for us, you have a checklist of things you want, whether it's a face-off guy, penalty killer, scorer, leadership, hard to play against, physical. You have all these things, and when you go and look through your group, you see what you already have versus what you're lacking. So when it is free agency and there's 3 or 4 guys up there and you're like, okay, well, who has these boxes that we haven't checked? Some of those intangibles are hard to measure. That's where relationship building is huge, whether it's talking with other teams that maybe have had pro scouts, coaches, ex-players, current players, things like that. So it's so hard, but it is a fine balance. But if you create your framework of what you want your team and identity, every team identity is different, then it makes it a little bit easier.
Brett?
Yeah, I think, hockey's such an interesting sport because I think, as you said, the intangibles are on display a little bit more apparent in our sport. When you look at the teams that have won the Stanley Cup, Tampa comes out to mind, Boston comes out to mind. They have these core pieces of leadership winners, the second, the third efforts, and you put that in tandem with, all your analytical research about what a player does in terms of conditioning, his, what his points are, where he scores from, all those things, and you put together a recipe. But at the end of the day, what we have in hockey is something really special, where you have hockey players that will put themselves at jeopardy in search of their team. And I think that is a big piece of when you're searching for these players and building a team is creating that culture and creating that leadership and finding winners.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Megan.
I'll also loop in like the coaching element too, because although, it seems like it's a revolving door, each team kind of trades around coaches. You have a team like Carolina with Rob Brendamore, and they're just very hard to play against. They're very good defensively. They seem to have a lot of structure, and that they're shooting a lot. They have the most shot attempts in the league, and they have great rebound recovery because they're expecting it. So they all play as this one system that game over game, night after night, they're really hard to defeat. And I feel like, with that coaching element to have people be very aware of not only style of play, but what they should contribute to end in, more goals versus less goals, expected goals, and in terms of just quality play. Carolina and what Brendamore has done in terms of that coaching element, that leadership element, feels like they can kind of trade anyone into that system, and they seem to do better. And, they got a player from Edmonton who I feel like a lot of the media and fans weren't, kind of had turned against him, but he'll probably do well in Carolina, to be honest.
This question of coaching is an interesting one. You think about another example, Bruce Cassidy, a lot of success here in Boston. Mm-hmm. He goes to Vegas. They have success too.
Yes.
But lo and behold, the Bruins have this historic season. There's more than one way to skin a cat, obviously, but it's about finding that balance, finding that chemistry with what you need. You guys all touched on it. Kate, I want to go back to you, back to the kind of rebuild question. And one of the things I want to touch on and hear from your perspective is about this issue of timing. And you guys, you draft Jack Hughes. You have an idea in mind of what that development trajectory is going to look like, but in the meantime, you have to make some pretty difficult decisions in the next few years. What goes into those decisions when it comes to this idea of timing in terms of that window, that target you guys are trying to build? Is there anything you can share on that front?
Yeah, so for us, it's how we kind of think about it is who are our core pillar players. So one being Jack Hughes, another could be Nico Hischier, Dougie Hamilton on defense. And it's kind of creating a vision around who those players are and their timelines. So for us, I actually see it like our timeline, we probably did exceed expectations this year, but it's just starting. Our biggest thing is sustained success. So we want to be in it, yes, this year, next year, but we're not willing to give up the farm just to be in it this year, just to make a push. We want to be in the same spot in 8-9 years. There are teams that do that. Look at Pitt for so long being in the playoffs year in, year out. And so for us, it's all about being disciplined, as I said before, to the timelines, but it's making sure they're aligned. And there's only so much money that can go around, right? So you do have to draft well. So you have some of those cheaper contracts on their entry-level deals. And so for us, we know Jack, Nico, Dougie, their contracts are aligned in a sense of our time frame that our next few years are when we do need to strike. So it may not technically be this year right now, but this to me is the start of the window. But alignment's huge, and that's where you need to develop well, draft well, because you need those players coming up. If you do give out high-end value contracts, you need some of those third, fourth line grinders who can come up that may be a little lesser value, but you've drafted them, you hold their rights, so you have that opportunity to have them in your lineup. So for us, it's really going around our core players, and we determined that probably 2 or 3 years ago when Tom Fitzgerald took over and the blueprint and strategy he had, and we've kind of stuck through since.
And Brett, where does this issue of timing weigh in your priority list with the Panthers? How weighted is it, in other words, in all the decisions that you guys have to make on a year-to-year basis? Well,
I think, again, I think every team has got to assess where your players are at, what their age is, what value they have, and move your chips around the board accordingly. When you look at the teams that are consistently at the top, they do such a great job retooling on the fly and rebuilding and reinserting into the cupboards. And I think that's where the NHL is now. If you look at the Eastern Conference in particular, I mean, it's scary. And every game is a battle. And You know, I sure wouldn't want to see a Panther in the rearview mirror, but you know, it's been fun. So, I think, you know, when you're looking at all these assets that you have and in the games that you have to play, you have to always be in mind of where can you be and how good can you get, how quickly can you be there.
Megan, it seems like in this cap era, it's harder than ever to build a dynasty, because once you have success, it becomes so difficult to keep your players. We're seeing, Chicago paying now for the 3 cups that they were able to achieve. It's just hard to keep things together.
I think that's the nice thing about the hard cap is there is a sense of parity, right? You do have those teams that sort of ebb and flow, President's Trophy, out of the playoffs. You have some shuffling, but then there's somewhat luck, like more luck in hockey, right? If you're the Mets, you just go out and have great scouting, have a lot of resources, and buy a lot of players. But, you can't do that in the NHL. So there's that one sense of like these very incremental, sure, you can be smart and whatever, but if you have that puck that bounces and, you lose in overtime, that's that. Your season's over. So I think it's great in terms of like fans being engaged, every market feeling like they have a spot. It's bad in that, that lottery ball, whoever gets Bedard maybe keeps their job a little bit longer. Or like, player salaries. It's like Phil Mickelson makes what? And Connor McDavid makes what? Like how does that make sense? Like he may be one of the most dominant players in all sports right now. And he's, paid like a golfer that doesn't even make a cut. So that's a problem, but
I'll take Connor McDavid's salary.
Well, I think we're all witnessing historic greatness, that's for sure, and we've also been witnessing, historic levels of offense across the board. We're seeing players have career years more than we ever have before. It's an exciting brand of hockey that we're all fortunate to watch, and this playoffs is shaping up to be unforgettable. Brett, I want to come back to you. You mentioned this idea of retooling on the fly, and the Panthers have had an uncanny knack for finding basically players from the discard pile of other teams and turning them into core pieces. Right off the top, you've got Verhaeghe. Duclair bounced around quite a bit before finding a home there. Forsling was on waivers. Sam Bennett was playing on the 4th line in Calgary. It's been really, really important for you guys. I know there's only so much you can share in terms of what goes into evaluating those players and, finding those diamonds in the rough. But what I wanted to ask in particular was, is there something about the deployment side, the side where you're putting these guys in a position to succeed, an approach there that stands out for you guys?
Well, I mean, I think 85 degrees every day helps, and it's. I wouldn't say we've done a really nice job of identifying underappreciated players, and that's our analytics department. That's we've created a way to have traditional scouting and present day technology come together and find a recipe that we think works. And I think that's no different than most teams. We don't. I would say that most teams, players need opportunity, and if you can create that and foster that, then they might be able to do something that people don't expect.
Montour's another guy that comes to mind. The opportunity presents itself this year. He steps right into a bigger role and performs. It's been remarkable what you guys have achieved on that front. Megan, back to this whole roster construction thing. Is there any trends you've observed in terms of strategies the last couple of years? One of the questions, perhaps is how teams are deciding to deploy capital by position. How much are they investing in defense versus goalies versus forwards? Obviously, we're seeing this, trend league-wide where, the core superstars are eating up a ton of that cap room. What comes to mind in terms of larger trends strategically there?
Well, I definitely think structuring those deals, like I was saying, those big market teams that are paying those big bonuses and then not having to, have the salaries structured away so that they're immovable, I think is really smart. Clearly, goalies are like a #1 actual elite goalie in the NHL. Like you can almost count them on your hands. And the same goalie that is year over year and that goals above expected is, very few. It's not necessarily repeatable of like understanding, okay, this goalie is going to perform. So, that's tough in the playoffs because you always need that goalie checklist, right? When you have that really tough hockey that's like the 1-goal games. So I think that there's elements for sure that, people are, obviously it's a copycat league in a way, look at what works, what's, going, I don't want to say LTIR, but I think that's what everyone's thinking as well, right? There's ways to weaponize the cap to ramp up in the playoffs as well. So yeah, there's no like one way to do it. And I think it's all depends on, who's available, who wants to come to your market. So some markets that are smaller markets struggle too. And they have to find who will want to play there, who comes there. Doesn't have, and I know Patrick Kane was, had his eye on New York. So even if you're in the game to get him and you were one of those top 10 teams, you weren't going to get him. So there's other constraints that I think are a bit unknown. And you just have to do the best you can as a GM to make your roster best for obviously a playoff push, but then, further down the line too, you don't want that one and done either.
For sure. You think about, markets like Edmonton, you've got, again, these players in their prime, and there's a lot of pressure to win now. And Toronto's another example.
Yeah, 26-year-old Connor McDavid, right? Is it enough?
Yeah.
Do they have enough goaltending and depth? And,
yeah.
When Leon Draisaitl, who is passing to Connor, is chasing him down on these records, you have to kind of scratch your head and think, they could do more.
Yeah. Do you think it is the hardest it's ever been to build a dynasty in the NHL right now?
Well, essentially in this hard cap era,
yeah.
Without a doubt, because it does have those like small moves or even like a player that, you just can't re-sign. That's a core piece that, plays well with each other. They have great chemistry, love the coach, but they need to get paid.
Yeah.
So you're seeing that overturn that then breaks up what could be that window that we're all talking about. So sort of the unfortunate part of the hard cap is, you lose some of that synergy moving forward with that group that, tends to like balloon at certain times, that aging curve of like whatever, 24 to 28. You really want to capture the most value out of that and have, the pieces that will work with that. Because as we were saying too, like who even plays PP1 on the New York Rangers, right? Like there's only one puck. They can't all pass. They can't all shoot at the same time.
Exactly. And expectations, change. It's, last year when they surprised everyone, it's a different thing. So we'll see the exciting playoffs. I want to switch gears and get to some of the questions that have been coming in. First one I have here is, are there certain analytical methods you use to grade the value of future assets, i.e., the difference between a 2023 versus a 2024 draft pick or expiring veteran contracts? Kate, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I can jump on that. We do. If you ask me the ins and outs of it, I'll be honest, couldn't answer. That's our analytics group, and they're awesome. They do all these models, internal models, using some external models and things of that nature. But we do, when you're thinking, okay, should we give up a 2023 fourth-round pick, a 2024 second-round pick, fifth-round pick, like there are values assigned to it, and we have the values chart. So we do use things like that. Also, in terms of prospects, there's a lot more data than there used to be, maybe even 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So when you're looking at prospects, we have our development coaches that help, but when you're putting in players into a deal or thinking of signing them or not signing them, whether out of college or their junior leagues, we do have the eye test, but we have numbers now more than ever. So we do use that as part of the piece to the puzzle, and there's all the models. There are contract value models we use as well, which is we do I'd say the old school method of using comparables, platform year, current year, things like that through the league, but then we also have models that are comparing it analytically to what they should be compared to what recent contracts just went to. So there's a lot of different aspects that we take into play.
Brett, this one might be a good fit for you. When it comes to making a big organizational decision, draft trade, calling up, et cetera, how do you guys balance all the voices in the room? And this question in particular is asking, are the players ever part of that decision making?
You know, I mean, I think management makes those decisions. Are the players ever part of the decision? I think players make decisions for us, right? If the trade deadline, you know, where the team is, that might decide whether you push or not, or if a player's not playing well, that might suggest he needs to go down to the minors. So without actually, you know, vocalizing anything, how they perform will tell you, and they'll tell you where we're at with as a club. I think that, you know, with their process, yeah, there's a lot of people that weigh in on the decisions on player movement at any time, or, you know, should we push or should we stand pat? But that's what makes a good decision, right? Is when we have a collective group of core people that have completely different views, and then we come together and we figure out what's the best decision for our organization.
Mm-hmm. Megan, I'm going to throw this one to you. It's
Sure.
It's about LTIR.
Oh, no.
you had already
I didn't
mentioned
say it. I didn't say it. Whoever's recording this.
Basically, what are your thoughts on the increased usage of LTIR?
Well, it's a rule for a reason, right? And they're following the rules. I mean, I'm obviously not on the legal side, so I'm just like analytically looking at it. But clearly, they want them to follow the rule for the right purpose, and they've been very vocal about that as well. But I think that's a part of the problem with a hard cap is like you're trying to find edges in certain things. So, using that to make sure that the player is fully healed, fully ready. I mean, there's clearly a really good purpose for it. It's just making sure that there's that, gatekeeping, that it's proper for each team and each team has the same, ability to use it and not use it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is
that a political way of answering?
That's a good answer.
Okay.
This question is specific, but it touches on a wider question about, we talked about the trade deadline, teams going all in. And, the Bruins in particular, they make some of these trades for, Bertuzzi, Orlov, Hathaway. Is there a way to quantify going all in? Is there a way to quantify that in terms of the investment, the doubling down, the question of that risk taking that's gone into going that kind of a route? Kate, do you want to try to? I know it's a hard one.
Yeah, it is a hard one. I think when you're giving up some of those higher end picks is when you kind of see it. If you're willing to give up a first round this year for a player, I also think sometimes we all read Twitter, right? Sometimes I think it was Tampa this year or was it last year? Sometimes you look at giving up those picks, but that pick might be what you need to win the Stanley Cup. So yes, it looks like you're giving away a first, but it's like, okay, a first or the Stanley Cup, I think we'd all take the Stanley Cup. So sometimes—
I think that was a Breezeball quote.
Was it? Okay, yeah. I'm like, I don't know what I've seen the last 7 days. It was somewhere. So for me, I think when you see some of those higher end picks go prospects, that's kind of when you're like, okay, are they making that move? But it's also like, well, that's what they may need to do to get to where they want to be. So it is hard to quantify picks because you can't just say, like as I was saying before, a first round pick's worth this, because if that's the piece you need to the puzzle, it's actually probably worth a different value. So for me, when you see those picks, those prospects go up, is when you kind of start to say like, oh, okay, are they trying not to whether go on all in, or if they're at the fork in the road, maybe they don't want to retool, rebuild, and they're trying to accelerate it the other way, like the Boston Rangers example. So that's kind of when you start to see it from a high level for me.
Absolutely. I do want to interject with one of my own questions that I don't think we've touched on yet, which is specifically about puck and player tracking. And it's still pretty evolving in terms of at the teams figuring out how to generate the most value out of it. Is there anything you guys can share about where you're at with that process, and where some of the potentially most valuable future endeavors are going to be coming from in that respect?
Want to take that one?
Sure.
You guys are rolling.
Oh, okay, I'll go for it. I'd say it's still, when I think about analytics, baseball, basketball, hockey, quite frankly. I think there's a lot of growing room. I think it's also, we talked about this before, it's an extremely fluid sport, whether guys are getting off shift changes, short shifts, 30 seconds to 50 to a minute and a half, depending on if you're on a specialty team. And so for me, there's so much fluidity that it is hard to capture. We've had it for a year and a half fully now. And we're using it, but I think there's still a lot more from the team perspective that we need to figure out. It does create a lot of like cool graphics, like when you can use the puck, and you can use it sometimes to show players the system. Like, hey, this is actually you, not just looking at the bodies. These are the dots moving, and this is where the puck's going. And if you were to do our system, you probably should have done the middle line drive, whatever it is. And so for us, it's using the analytics and the models and the player and puck tracking. I think there's still a good amount of room to go, to be quite honest, but we've only had it for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I would say we're at the tip of the iceberg with it and diving deep, but it takes time. And I think we have that information and we have our own information, and we're using it in conjunction and testing it, which is what you're supposed to do, finding trends, things like that. So yes, using it, yes, can go a lot deeper. And yes, I believe most teams will in the coming years. As you have more experience with it, you'll use it more.
Maybe even just to maximize like player performance. I know we see in the NBA this like anger over load management, but there's always that thing too, like, could you play Connor McDavid the full game? Not to go back to him, but those kind of questions of like, what's optimal shift length? Where are these players actually skating? Where's the puck going? All of these questions that before you just look at a box score and it's a complete chasm to the other areas. Now you know how they're passing. You know, we have our own tracking data too that we can interface with PPT, and like, there's just a lot that can go on in terms of not only player and contract understanding, but also fan engagement, like the whole new world of like sports betting and digital. And, you know, I feel like that's where the convergence of all the capital now injected into this tech side will really help understand player performance, and then like the sports science side better. So like talking about injuries earlier, it's like, how do you identify them before they happen? Are they skating differently? Are they moving differently? You know, now with like frame type data, you can understand that, their movement patterns. Have they changed it? You know, what's their shin to, you know, hip angle? All of those like interesting questions that before someone would just like eyeball it and try to see a player a lot. Now you have that quantified immediately.
I'd say too, sorry, just jumping kind of off of what you were saying is, I think now you're seeing hockey there's a lot more sports science versus just analytics coaching. Now there is sports science to try and help predict some of those things. You do get more data. So I know personally we're investing more in that. I think a lot of teams are, but I think that's where there's an opportunity to growth for a lot of teams in the league with this new data is the sports science. I don't know if we'll ever get to load management like the NBA. I know that's a hot topic, but I think it is a stepping stone for us to, again, evaluate. And see what the eye test matches with the numbers, right? You have
we want to see Jack Hughes skate every night.
Yeah. We're not taking him out of lineup. So it's just another tool in the toolbox.
Brett, I think I'll come to you for the next one. This isn't particularly a question about the Panthers, but across the league, you know, with the growth, obviously Kate touched on the fact that maybe hockey's a little bit behind the other sports in terms of the adoption of analytics. Are you seeing... I know we're seeing growth of it. I know we're seeing adoption of it grow, particularly though the coaches. There's always been this old school hockey coach, image in everybody's mind. Are you seeing that go away? Are you seeing just a lot more receptivity from the coaches as they realize how much it can help them, achieve better results?
Well, yeah, I think you're seeing it right now in the NHL. You know, there's so much parity. Right? And information's king. So the more information, the more data that we can give our coaches and our staff, and I think all teams are like this, to best do their job, it eliminates guessing. You know, we have amazingly brilliant people coming up with, whether it be high performance, whether it be analytics, and, giving us information like, hey, listen, maybe you take the plane at this time versus that time. And which 10, 15 years ago would have never thought about, And so I think all teams, all coaches are now receptive to, in my opinion, to information and receiving that data so they can, do their job to the best of their ability. So I think it is changing.
Sure, yeah, and I think it is the assistant coaches too that are doing more of like the tactical, like, hands-on work, trying to figure out whether it's like special teams or goaltending, a lot more engaged with the data than even 5 years ago for us. Yeah. So course, like the head coach, a lot of like leadership and different moving parts, so maybe not as like, on their radar. But I think anyone that's coming up in any sort of system is like all ears, more analytics, more, using tech to their advantage to just be more efficient. Because hockey groups in general are really small compared to other sports. Yeah. You talk about the Mets and there's like 100 people in player development, and you go to hockey and there's like 3 guys that show up,
yeah.
in tracksuits, and you're like, really?
In tracksuits?
But
You kind of mumbled that. I want to make sure everybody.
But I mean, you want to like have all the staff be as optimal as possible to do the best job they can for these, high performance athletes. And I think that's how we grow hockey too, right? Keep pushing forward, both on like developing the players, but also making the game more interesting by using data to change how people play.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Kate, this question of like, the data scientists and, the experienced hockey people, going up a learning curve, everyone's got to go up a learning curve as you start to become a more data-driven organization. How has it worked at with the Devils in terms of finding the right systems to collaborate around these things? For me, one of the things that comes to mind as being most important is simply the communication. There's just a real specific language to the data that you have to become accustomed to, and likewise the coaches, they've got hard experience that they've learned, they've got really good questions. How's that worked in terms of bridging that gap?
Yeah, communication's big, and I think scheduling as well, especially as we go into the end of the regular season into the playoffs. So for us, I think it's also knowing where you're at in hockey. Our sports scientist isn't going to go to our head coach, Lindy Ruff, and be like, to your point, we're going to sit out Jack Hughes for 4 games because he looks a little tired. But yeah, he wouldn't be coming back the next day. But what he may do is, hey, X players' numbers look a little off to their baseline. We do testing a certain amount of times. Maybe we do a shorter sprint practice. So maybe instead of 40 minutes long, it's 20 quick. Or maybe we do 2 days off this week, 1 day just a skills, or just a come in, stretch, massage day. So that's where it's kind of those conversations. Now, things always happen. You have a terrible loss. You're not really given the off day. There's always those give and takes, but we kind of say it's the 80-20 rule. Is like 80% stick to the plan, 20 is when you can deviate because of the flight might get canceled, right? Now you can't travel. You have to. There's all these other operational logistics. So for us, it's our sports scientists coming up with the plan, communicating it, and it's also like the coaches don't know who's tired, who's not. They might have a sense, again, from the eye test, but the numbers are what's really saying it. So if his watt bike or whatever is off multiple percentages, multiple days, it's like, okay, well, 1, he is tired. 1, is it an injury that might be coming on? And in the communication to our athlete care group and our coaches, and then it's making the decision together. But it's not like 0 to 100. It's a slower progression, but communication is probably the biggest aspect of it with the scheduling.
And Brett, how much have you seen the players start to be interested in the data? Are they starting to show more interest for the sake of their own improvement, their own performance? And is that line of communication open, to share that with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a job. These players are professionals, and they know, they have their own internal metrics that they want to hit, and this information is available to them and might give them a better chance to, be a 30-goal scorer, to be a plus player, right? So they're in tune to stay in the National League, right? Which is that's not an easy thing to do. Have a 10-year career by any stretch. So I think that right now, in my opinion, hockey players are smarter than they've ever been. They have resources. We have technology now. They're in tune to where the game is going, where it is right now, and they want to be a part of it. So I think that a lot of the players have sought out, personal plans through high performance, whether it be diets, summer training. We classify players nowadays as hockey players. They're 12-month athletes, right? They don't get out of shape. When I was playing, you went to training camp to get into shape. So now they don't get out of shape. They're always monitoring where they're at, and I think that it's definitely apparent by the information that's available.
Do you want to add anything to either of those two discussions?
Completely agree, and I also think it's a generation now too, right?
Yeah.
So digital first, on their phones. We send them links to different data sets, videos, breakdowns, and no problem on the plane, looking at it, have great discussions, very engaged, want to be better. They really care when it's contract year 2 about their data, so that's kind of fun to watch. But definitely that progression, and then working with these other specialized groups, right? Whether it's like their own trainers in the summer off season trying to get better or work on certain skills, like data to really pinpoint how they can make that change and contribute more the next season. There's so many like change agents that I think analytics helps with in hockey that, you know, that sub 25-year-olds are just eating it up. And the programs too are now so competitive too, like the USA, you know, NTDP program, obviously the World Juniors, Hockey Canada, like there's just so much that goes into developing these players at such a young age. The CHL, obviously very, you know, have very sophisticated, in some cases they have like more sophistication than some NHL teams, the CHL. Yeah. So it's really cool to like see that not only, you know, aggression early with data, but like the progression through their career now.
I think when I was with the Rangers and they first started posting Corsi in the locker room after games, you can imagine there were a lot of rolled eyes. That's the last thing they wanted to see. They've already had a rough enough night. But you know, now I think, as you're saying, it's a new kind of player. They're used to data. They're used to technology, and I think they're seeing it for the ways that it can help them versus the way that it can strictly be, evaluation mode or, feeling judged, and, things like that. It's a tool, like a lot of tools they have and resources they have to help them be better, which is at the end of the day what we all want. From the broadcast side, for us, the data is helping us tell stories. For me, one of the exciting things about whether it's the pucker player tracking or some of the data that we get from Stathletes is just being able to tell stories, for me particularly, about some of the more unheralded players in terms of what their value is. Because we want to teach fans and educate fans about what the players are doing on the ice, why they're doing it, and why it's valuable. And for me, the defensive side too is something that is very underappreciated. And so we're seeing more ways to tell those stories, which is great. A little bit along those lines, at the amateur level, is there still things that we don't have yet? We've got obviously the best tech possible at the NHL level. Maybe start with you, Megan, because this is right up your alley.
It's a cost thing, and as well, people don't realize that hockey is so international, right? You see these other sports that are like in bubbles, like even the NFL and football, right? You get that college group, they can track them in that. Hockey, it's like I go all over the world, Sweden, Finland, Eastern Europe. Obviously, there's huge presence and big push, and it's amazing for the game, but it's extremely hard rink to rink. You're indoors too. You don't know people's setups. Their video still is not great in some rinks, and always issues that come up with like players wearing white jerseys on white ice with a lot of occlusions. So, there's ways to sort it out, but there certainly has to be a more of a push worldwide to standardize certain things to make it just a lot easier to, understand even prospects, right? You see some GMs that have links to certain countries, and you know why they draft certain people. Mm-hmm. It would be nice to see that playing field a bit level, just so everyone has the same resources and analytics and understanding of these players.
Brett, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think this is still where hockey still has an old school component to it, right? Where, you need the eye test, you need fantastic scouts, you need people coveraging all over the world to make sure that, the player that we get fits our identity. Even at the college level, they don't have as much as the data as you would expect yet, and they're not tracking that. So, there's a hole there. There's a gap from the youth hockey, from the amateur side to professional side.
Is it a question, sorry to interrupt, is it a question of standardization, or is it simply that the data is not there at all?
Well, I think that right now the data is not there,
yeah.
in my opinion. There's a gap in terms of getting that data if you're going to, northern Sweden to get some of the games, and you're looking at a guy, and the scout tells you that this is the guy, and you're looking at another place, and you've got 15 pages of information, and you've got to fly over there and hopefully don't get stuck in a snowstorm, and then he's got to pass the eye test, right? So I think that there is a gap, and I think that we're getting better in trying to bridge it, but there still is a gap.
Kate?
Yeah, I'd probably reiterate what you guys both said. I think sometimes it's really hard. You're comparing apples to oranges. And so for us, that's where, though, you can get a diamond in the rough. We had Jesper Bratt in the 6th round for us personally, and that's where there probably wasn't as much data in the Swedish Junior B League versus in the KHL, if there's a player playing there, or in the CHL, things of that nature. So sometimes, as Brett was saying, it's hard when there's so much good on this player and there's only some on this player. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just not there. And so that's where you really do have to rely on the scouts and things of that nature. So I think it's getting to a better place, but some of those other regions, there isn't data. And if it is, it's, okay, how reliable is it? Because it's probably 1 or 2 years versus 10, 12 years and things like that. I mean, sometimes you even look and I'm like, where's the time on ice? Things as simple as that. So again, progressing, but it is hard to compare, and amateur scouting, probably the hardest. It's a lot of apples to oranges, and then trying to make it as apples to apples as possible.
This is kind of related to one of the questions coming up here, but a little bit different, and maybe for you, Brett, is there a difference in the decision parameters that go into drafting a first, second round player and a later round player? You know, is it a different set of decision-making priorities? You know, in other words, for a first round player, it's kind of like, hey, we know a lot about him. We know he's got a proven track record. We've got a lot of data. 6th round, there's, 7th rounder, it's kind of like, well, he's a great athlete. Is there some different way you approach these things?
Well, I think, again, you have your recipe of what you're looking for and what you want your prospects to be in, if you're a player that's coming from Europe, you're going to have to assess this project has to be complete by the time he's 21. If it's a player that's going to college, that project now gets kicked till he's 24. Right, so the ages are different. So you do have it is weighted a little bit, but I would say that the core values of trying to identify the best player in the needs that you have, the spots, the shortages that you need to fill is still king. But there is different equations that go into what a 4th round goalie might be worth as opposed to a 7th round goalie, right? So where is that player at? What's the track record? So there's a lot of moving targets, and I would say that your amateur staff, it's actually pretty fun to listen to them battle for the guys, but it's going through that process, and they speak their piece, and then you have the analytical people come in and speak their piece, and then obviously everyone comes to a conclusion on this is what makes us a better club. So
I still remember when I was drafted by the Rangers, I was up in the crowd, I could see down that the Rangers draft table, one of the scouts, arguing on my behalf right before I was picked. They get very passionate about, and they put blood, sweat, and tears, and it's awesome to see. Kate, did you want to add anything on that question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of similarly, you make your draft board, and people have different strategies, whether you're drafting for best available player or skill or size or whatever it is your GM's vision. For us too, I think one of the other things, when you get into the later rounds, it ends up sometimes being positionally, like you're not going to have 4 picks all be centers. You're like, okay, we need to share the love a little bit. Some teams want to take goalies high. Some just want one goalie in a draft because the volatility of it. So I think sometimes positions do play a part in it. For us, it's not usually at the higher end of the draft, but you do think about that. Some teams think about their current team, some teams don't. It might just be best available player versus some might say you have 2 strong centers, maybe let's go for a D. So every team has different strategies on how they do it, but I do think position at a point in the draft plays a part.
Did you have anything you wanted to add on that last question?
It's very easy to look back and criticize, right, that 5-year redrafting. I think it's really hard to do that prediction in that moment. And even like that idea of, what's that ceiling for the player? Because you may know, okay, this player has these attributes and this is what they're doing analytically and this is where I think they'll go. But then you see those players that end up exceeding expectations, and obviously that's where a lot of the value is found, especially if you can draft them later, like Bratt, right? That's amazing. So the more of those hits you can get, the more you have that, in that RFA cheap group that will just help propel you forward. So it's quite the science, but also art. And obviously scouting plays a huge part in like narrowing that down after the analytics happen.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people forget too that in hockey we're drafting players younger than in the other sports.
Yes.
So it
Yes.
really
Can you imagine
is,
at 17 being like, what am I going to be in 5 years? Like, I have no idea. Like, it's a projection on 17, 18-year-olds. Like, oh my God, it's wild. But the scouts, like, they work so hard and they're so good at what they do.
for sure. Well, that just about does it for our panel. And thanks to each of you for joining us, and thanks to all of you for joining us as well.